Hello. Today is the 24th of March 2023. My name is Norbert Meyn and I'm here with Raphael Wallfisch, the cellist and professor here at the Royal College of Music, to talk about the generation of his parents, and especially composers in the generation of his parents who emigrated from Germany and Austria in the 1930s and 40s to make their home in Britain. But to start with this conversation, I would like to ask you, first of all, could you tell us when and where you were born?
Yeah, well, I was born on June the 15th, 1953, there was a maternity hospital right next to Whitestone Pond in Highgate. And I remember when I was a student in Los Angeles, I went to a party one evening at my teacher's house, Gregor Piatigorsky, and one of his best friends was Danny Kaye. And we played the Schubert Quintet, and Danny Kaye was there listening. And afterwards he asked me, when were you born? Exactly this question, I said the same thing. And where were you born? I said, well, I was born in Highgate. Oh, so you're a rich kid, are you? said, it was all about my socks, actually.
Okay.
That was because my socks were too short, and he said, if you're a rich kid, you should have socks that go up to here. And the lesson for life, when you're playing, you should not show your legs. You know, your socks should be down there. So that was my education about socks. So when you say, where, if anybody asks where I was born, I always have to think of that.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, but that gives us a place and a time to place you. So, to start with, could you say a few words about your parents? And particularly, maybe we should start with your mother. I mean, I had the honor of interviewing her, Anita Lasker Wallfisch, for this oral history project as well. But it'd be lovely to hear a few words from you about her story, and also, what it means to you, really.
Well, I have to say that me and my sister were brought up with very little of the story of our parents, because their aim bringing us up was to bring us up as normally as possible without the baggage of the what had happened to them when they were young people and before they came to Great Britain. And so I think it was in many ways it was very wise of them. So it was just normal to be really, the story was never explained until we were old enough to begin to ask questions. So the only thing that obviously I noticed, and I don't remember when I first noticed it, was that there was a number on my mother's arm, and she didn't want to or need to hide it, wasn't in cover it up. It was there. I guess I thought it was a phone number at first or something. I had no idea. And I probably didn't ask, or if I did ask, it was until she felt I was old enough to know something about it, she would have just brushed it off, And little by little, I think that the history began to filter into me because of the very few relatives that there were here that we would visit from time to time. There was a Tante Gretel and a Tante Liesel. And why were they called Tante, why not Auntie? And well, they were very much the older, another generation older than my parents, and much less assimilated into British society. So they were very much coming from there. And I think it was just a very gentle introduction for us, which in a way was good, in a way maybe not so good, because if we hadn't asked questions, and I don't think they would have said very much, actually. So it was really a question of when my mother, who was in the English Chamber Orchestra for many, many, many years, when she was persuaded by her colleagues, when they were on tour and they had a lot of time together, they said, come on, Anita, tell us something more about the time. And she did, and then they said, you should write it down. And she did. and she decided to write it down in private form for my sister and myself, and that became her book, which is published and now in many, many languages.
Inherit the Truth, much to be
there's
recommended.
A copy in
the exhibition here.
At the exhibition, yeah.
And it's a very, very matter-of-fact account of what happened, and it's really backed up by a lot of documents, which is fascinating. But I mean, you know, the family came from Breslau, and of course she was imprisoned for forging documents, you know. But in some ways, she survived because, you know, when she arrived at Auschwitz, she said to people that I play the cello, and of course, then she ended up with Alma Rosé, the niece of Mahler, I think, or
and the daughter of Arnold Rosé, who was the leader of the Vienna Philharmonic. Actually, I should just say, I know we're jumping quickly, but my wife, Elizabeth, her grandfather was Albert Coates, the conductor, and after her mother, my mother-in-law died, we got a lot of photographs, including many of Coates conducting the Vienna Philharmonic, and there he is, and there is Arnold Rosé. So, you know, if only, you know, fate is extraordinary.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, fortunately, she survived, and then she came to Britain eventually after the war, and then she met your father. But in Paris originally, but they came both from Breslau, which is again.
What happened was that.
But your father's.
My father was also born in Breslau, and he actually went to the same school as my mother, which was called the Rediger Schule, which was a Jewish school in the middle of Breslau, which still stands in Wrocław, which is now when the Poles took over that place. I went back once and went with an old map of the old street, and I found the school amongst some tower blocks, some really communistic tower blocks. For some reason that hadn't been destroyed, and it's still a school. In 1937, my dad was picked together with Erich Grünberg and his brother Eli, who changed his name to Göran and became very famous as, very well known as leader for many years of the Allegri Quartet and of the BBC Symphony. And these two brothers were picked together with my father and a few other children, because they were in their early teens, as talented youngsters who, Emil Hauser, who was a member of the Budapest Quartet and was very friendly with the British protectorate officials in Palestine, wangled visas for these kids to get out of Germany. And my father was lucky enough. So he auditioned them and said, yes, you know. And so Erich Grünberg and Eli and my father were all together in this group, came over from the middle of Europe to the desert, basically, to the British-run Palestine. And I'm not sure whether Erich and Eli had any other relatives with them, but certainly my father had his mother, my grandmother came, and his brother. So he was there until the end of the war, and then was able to go to Paris to study. And when he was in Paris, my mother was already in London, and Erich was in London, and said, "Oh, by the way, you should go. I think Peter Wallfisch is in Paris now." Peter Wallfisch, that fat chap, you know, little chap from my school. Yes, you might like to go and see how he is now. And so she decided on a whim to go over to Paris on a ferry. Would have been 1947, something like that, 48. And there he was, living literally in a garret, with just one room. And that's how they met again, yeah.
So then they formed a family, and I mean, it wasn't easy for your father to come to Britain as well. There needed to be some very special circumstances for that to happen, and fortunately it did. And then you were born, and what was it like to grow up in this musical household? I mean, you know.
Well, it was very happy, and we had a tiny flat just off the Portobello Road, you know, a square called Colville Square, which at the time was a slum. It really was a slum, and but we loved our flat, top flat, and now it's very expensive. I mean, I couldn't afford, you know, just in that area. But what I do earliest memories was not being allowed to go out and play, sort of 1958, 59, because of the Notting Hill riots, because there were, you know, the Teddy Boys and black people there was real violence then, and now it's very gentrified, of course, you know, but we loved it there. We were right next to the market, and I grew up with the market, and I've loved markets ever since. My father had an attic room with the piano, and I always heard piano being practiced. So I heard great piano music from, I mean, apparently my cot was under the piano, so I really could not avoid it. There wasn't much room in the flat, you know, so you were either under or on something. You know, every room doubled as something else. But it was great, and we were very cozy there. And I lived there till I was 16. And then we moved to North London, and my mother still lives in the same house. But my mother was always out playing. She was really very, very busy, because she'd already established herself when my father wasn't allowed to work in Britain yet. She was already connected with musicians like Emanuel Horovitz, and then that led to being in the Boyd Neal Orchestra, which turned into the English Chamber Orchestra. And so she was quite early on in her arrival in the swing of things. And in the early 60s, for instance, I mean, she played in many chamber orchestras. There was the Haydn Orchestra, there were Mozart players that still exist, and so on and so on and so on. And then for at least 2 years, she played at least twice a day West Side Story when it first opened in London for the first time. And that really kept us going, West Side Story.
Bernstein.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can remember going, I must have been 7 or so, and went into the pit and heard the piece. And I'll never forget, if I think about it, I still get the same feeling of terror when Officer Krupke fires a shot. And I'd never heard a gunshot, of course, in my life. And that just stays with me forever.
And you heard that from the pit?
Yes, I mean, she couldn't find a babysitter that day, so I was in the pit. So I was surrounded by music of every sort. Well, not every sort. Well, yes, every sort, because the people downstairs, we were in the top flat, played pop music very loud, always, probably as a battle against what was going in our flat. So the floor shook like this, boom, boom, boom. And some years later, when I was about 9, I fell in love with the bugle. I thought the bugle was a great instrument. And my parents were delighted, and so they would send me sometimes to play the bugle outside the neighbor's door. But, it never came to a row. So they just turned the music louder. I played the bugle. And then when I got serious, I was playing the cello, which of course goes through the floor. So it was a noisy place.
Now, it's fascinating that you chose the cello of all instruments. It's the instrument that that helped your mother survive, and I'm just wondering, is there significance for you? Or was it by chance that you chose the cello?
Totally by chance, because I started, at the time when parents think, well, maybe their child should learn something, some instrument. So the violin was the first thing they gave me, and I don't remember anything about it, but I obviously didn't like it, and they didn't push me. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's the story all the way, because my parents never, even when I was, really serious, pushed in any way, and hardly ever interfered, which is extraordinary, really. But then I tried the piano, but I realized the piano was never free at home. It was always And I couldn't play like my father, so what's the point, you know? So that didn't work. And then they'd say, well, try the cello. And somehow that stayed. It was really like that. And it's only, I guess, I didn't ever have time, or, you know, you don't reflect when you're a child. You just get on with it. And I certainly wasn't reflecting that I'm playing the same instrument as my mother. The only thing was that she did, when I say she didn't interfere, she might be doing something in the house and would scream at me if I was playing out of tune, which was very upsetting, but probably a very good thing.
And do you still hear that voice sometimes?
Oh yeah. She's always been, and later too, you know, my fiercest critic, and most to the point, yeah.
And then, so who were your teachers, and did your parents' sort of Central European roots have something to do in the way, with the teachers they chose for you, or the way you were trained?
Well, I think when it came to the cello, you know, I was so privileged because all my mother's colleagues, orchestral colleagues too, I mean, I had all availability of the best possible teachers if they were interested to teach a young person. And I do remember all of them. And I feel sorry for a couple of them because I really wasn't a very good student when I was a child, because I was much more interested in other things until about, well, really until about 12 or 13. So at the early times, Jennifer Ward Clark was one of my very first teachers, who was a wonderful, she was very young then, and sadly she's no longer with us, but you know, she was a very influential cellist, not only in Baroque music, which she was very well known for at the Academy especially, but she was the first cellist in Peter Maxwell Davis's Fires of London group. And so she was a very fine player. And I still have the books that she wrote. So the lesson would go like that. I would play something and she would tell me then, and she would write it down, which was very good, but terribly boring for me because, you know, I was 9 or 8, you know. So there was lots of, but I'm glad I have the book still, because now I appreciate the lessons, you know. But she was so fastidious. And so I was lucky in so much that from the beginning, even if I wasn't interested, I was doing it correctly. And so later when I did become interested, you know, I had a good grounding. And I think by the time I got to my third teacher, who was Olga Hegedish, I was very interested. Olga was a colleague of my mother in the ECO. And then after that, I went to Amaryllis Fleming, who I'm so proud is now, the hall is named after her, because she was a huge influence in my life and a wonderful musician, a wonderful person.
So that connection with the RCM is already from that period as well, because she was connected with the RCM.
She taught here, yes,
and then,
much later
of course, your father did as well.
And eventually my father, since the 70s, he until he had to retire. In those days, 65 was, you had to retire, and that was sad for him because he really, really loved teaching here.
So can we talk a little bit about him as a musician? I mean, because you know he had quite some pedigree as a pianist, and he won the Bartók competition in Budapest, but it was such a hard time for any pianist's career really to take off. And but he did, you know, impress people with his playing, of course, and he made a professional career. So what was his playing like, and what was he like as a musician?
Well, he was, he had a very distinctive sound on the piano. He caressed the piano. It was a very warm, never aggressive approach to the piano. I mean, really, if I think about it, although he played a lot of contemporary music of the time, you know, he excelled in Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert. Those were his. He wasn't a Rachmaninoff player. He had quite small hands, so he knew that was never to be, or Liszt, you know. I mean, he learned some of those things when he was a student, but that was not going to be his métier. And luckily, as a pianist, you really can decide which way you want to go. There's so much repertoire. He was a very, very sought-after chamber musician. So he played with, he had many ensembles. I mean, during his career, he often played with the Melos ensemble. He played with Amaryllis. He had a duo with Christopher Bunting, with Maria Liedtke, and many others, Gervais Depire, William Pleath, all these people who were regular visitors to our flat or our house. So again, what was it like growing up? It was normal to hear the very best of everything all the time. I didn't question it. That's how it sounded. And also, I didn't question the fact that one practiced a lot. It was just normal. And when I started practicing a lot, apparently my father, who really was a workaholic, would come out of his room, hear me practicing, go back straight. I would come out, oh, he's practicing, I better get back. So this was very good. It was like having a pacemaker, you know, without, so then we'd meet at meal times.
Did you have a sense that, or do you think your father had a sense of being an outsider in Britain, or both your parents?
A very good question. My father, much more than my mother. Because my mother, as I said, integrated very quickly. After she'd recovered from arriving from Belsen and got back into the cello playing, William Pleath was her teacher, and then as an instrumentalist, as a string player, let's say, you immediately are playing with other people, and that is so socially. If you're a pianist, you're not playing with other people most of the time. You know, and that already is a big difference. And so she was very integrated, joining an orchestra. You have your colleagues, daily colleagues. So yes, she was far more. And my father did feel like an outsider, and that was difficult for him always, although he had many friends. But I know that for a fact, yeah.
Did he ever sort of think about maybe moving back or to the direction of Germany ever?
No. That's interesting how, because now after Brexit, that is I and my sister and my grandchildren and children all have German passports, simply because it's expedient to do that, you know, not because, well, only my sister actually feels a draw to live in Germany. I certainly don't. Mm-hmm. Our son Simon does, but that's more because there's so many more opportunities for him as a singer to live in Berlin than here at the moment, for sure.
Your grandfather was also killed during and you know your
only one grandparent survived. She went with my dad to Palestine, so I knew her a little bit, but the others didn't. But my parents absolutely didn't want to go there, although my father went back to play much earlier than my mother. My mother boycotted Germany, and so when the orchestra went, she didn't go, and it was many years until she did go, and then she realized, but you know, these young people have nothing to do with it. I will go, and she enjoyed going and meeting people, and did much more later with her education hat on, and my father went often and played, enjoyed it very much. I played together with him in Germany, because we played a lot together later in life. And let me think. He certainly didn't want to live in Israel, where he could have, because he was an Israeli citizen. But that was not for him either.
So you already just mentioned that you then played together with your father. So obviously you made a real success of cello playing, and you studied at the Royal Academy, which is the other place.
Well, before, what happened was that Amaryllis, who was an incredibly wise lady, when I was 16 and, you know, just O-level time, and there was a question, do I stay at school to do A-levels and, you know, everything? My parents kind of wanted me to. You'd have a really good education and not just disappear. But what clinched it was that my headmaster said, no, if you stay and do A-levels, you can't have any periods off to practice the cello. So, okay, so I left, and Amaryllis introduced me to Amedeo Baldovino, the cellist of the Trio di Trieste, who said I could, in between going to the academy, so I went to the academy at 17, the time between, I went and studied in Rome with him. So that was the first, and that was incredible for me. And I learned Italian very quickly, and just being on my own in a foreign country at that age was just wonderful. And Baldovino was astonishing cellist, and that's through Amaryllis. And then I went to the academy, Derek Simpson from the Aeolian Quartet, and then from there to America to Piatigorsky.
And how old were you when you started doing concerts with your father?
About 30, 31.
So it's quite, you were already really established.
I was already, yes, and he never wanted to play with me when I was a student or a child, so you just, you play with other people, and I played, yes I did, I played with my contemporaries, but it so happened because he had a trio with William Pleath and Gervais de Paya, and they decided that was it. William didn't want to play anymore, and so on. And so I took over that job, and Anton Weinberg, the clarinetist, and we had many years of playing clarinet trios and then recitals and so on, and that was really good.
And it took quite a while for him to get this position here at the RCM, but eventually, I think it's quite fair to say that for most Émigré musicians who came here, it took quite a while to make their way into educational institutions. And I think Maria Litka also became a professor here.
She did,
but
yes.
It was also only later in her life.
I honestly don't know how it happened exactly, and because my father always taught. He taught when he was a youngster. I've met people in Israel, elderly people, who said, I used to learn with your father. He was 15, but he was a terrific teacher. It's so nice to hear. And he loved that. He loved teaching, and his lessons always lasted 3 times longer than they should, much to the annoyance of my mother, because meals were always discussed. But I think he was an exceptional teacher, and so he was happy when he loved to come here. And I should say one thing, that I think that it's very interesting for me how this exhibition and everything that you've done for several years around this subject is fantastic and really remarkable. But it's interesting to me because it's been so normal, much part of my DNA, that I've never really thought about it. Now I think about it, and also obviously because of the music we'll talk about, it's become a focus of a lot of my repertoire. But it's very touching actually that it is of interest.
I think it's a big story, and it's particularly a story about migration, about people, integrating in a cultural environment and making it more dynamic, making it more interesting, and of course the life stories of your parents and many others are very moving stories, and they're often stories of achievement against the odds, great achievement often, and I think that's nowadays we have so much mixing and moving, but it's an inspiration, to see what your parents' generation, made of their lives and how they lived in, and continue to live in Britain. Yeah. So the next question I have is really about the repertoire that you've been playing, and we noticed, in connection with this exhibition, that you actually recorded a lot of works by Émigré composers.
People who are represented here. Yeah.
And so I was wondering if your family's history and your own story, if you had a particular interest in those composers because of their backgrounds, or if this is something that just happened.
Well, my awakening to the breadth of musical repertoire in general, outside of everybody we know, is thanks to my father, because he had, because it's now been his library, his archive, is now mostly in Schwerin in Germany, because after he died, and he was only 69 when he died. My mother was in despair because he had the most enormous library of very rare music. But he loved rare things. He loved to learn them, and I would hear I would say, what are you playing? And he would say this and this and this. I've never heard of that, So, and later I explored a lot of that music with him together. We played a lot of extraordinary things. A lot for the BBC when they were really interested, when you could go and do studio recordings of rare repertoire, and for other radio stations, because that, I benefited. I was very lucky to be still part of that time. Now it's different. BBC is not like that. It's different. It's still great, and so that kind of music, and including the composers that we're going to talk about, were things I discovered in my father's room, actually. A lot of it. I mean, I must tell you one story which is really extraordinary. So about 1979, Fritz Spiegel, is he mentioned here?
Fritz Spiegel is represented in the exhibition.
Yes.
And just to say, he was a flautist, also
Yes.
an Émigré, who was in the Liverpool Philharmonic.
Exactly.
And last week, I met his widow in
Yes.
Liverpool.
Right. Is she still there?
She's still, yeah.
Well,
I mean,
so
actually,
here's
both of them, because he was married twice.
So he was a great
yeah.
collector of things,
Yeah.
of music. And he knew my father was interested, so he sent a big bundle of Xeroxed paper, music, a sonata by one, at that time, not that spoken about, composer called Semlinsky. Because now we do know, but it was back in 79, 80, not really, only some people knew about it. So there was, and this is the autograph of Cello Sonata. And we tried to play it, and honestly, it was just ink blotch, and a lot of chords. You had no idea, what is that harmony, what is that? We tried, and then we put it back on the shelf, and forgot about it. And after he died, and I was going through the music, I found it, and of course I said, wait a minute, Semlinsky, this is really important. And sure enough, I got hold of, I forget his name, very famous musicologist who is the musicologist of British, Semlinsky, who's written books. I'll remember in a minute. And I wrote to him and said, I found this sonata we have, and we couldn't read it because it was, and he was furious. He said, in my book it says, but the cello sonata is lost. And I said, well, it's been in Willesden for the last 25 years, and he thought we'd kept it away, that we'd. And I said, on the contrary, we just couldn't read it. And now Anthony Beaumont is his name, and so then he kind of got over his, anger, and he deciphered it, and it's now published by Ricordi, and I played it and recorded it. It's an absolutely gorgeous work. But that's the sort of thing that would turn up on my father's shelf. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start talking about the composers. The first one is Hans Gál, and you met Hans Gál.
Yes.
in Edinburgh. And I mean, just a very brief outline of who he was. I mean, he was born in 1890 in Vienna, and had a really significant career as a composer of opera, of chamber music, of symphonic music, and he eventually became the director of the Mainz Conservatoire, and then was removed from that post in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, went back to Austria for a while, and then eventually came to Britain, and was interned on the Isle of Man, like most of the émigrés, and then was able to find a home in Edinburgh, and eventually became a lecturer in the university there, and a highly respected figure in the cultural life of Edinburgh. Also involved with the development of the Edinburgh Festival, and also composed more than half of his oeuvre in Britain, including the cello concerto, which was written in 1944. So that was when he's in his...
He's still in the camp?
No, in 1944 he was... I found that he was actually there was no employment for him in Edinburgh during the war, and so he found a position as a fire warden in an evacuated girls' school and a caretaker. So this is the former director of the Mainz Conservatoire we're talking about, and he must have had this time he wrote this amazing cello concerto there.
He certainly did, and I mean, honestly, I would put it on the level of any of the Schumann, Dvorak. It's the most lyrical, gorgeous piece, hugely challenging for a cellist, but very grateful to play. And all of the composers we're talking about, of course, their lives were saved by coming here, but they were victims of the sort of weird Glock era. So their music was considered so old-fashioned that it was not given the prominence, at the major festivals, at the proms and so on. I mean, much later, Glock was much later, but this is why this music really disappeared for so long. And now we're coming back and say, where's it been all our lives?
So let's listen to the first movement of the cello concerto by Hans Gál.
Not all of it.
No, but some of it,
Yes,
just so you get an impression.
Just beginning. It's very, very luscious and very Brahmsian. Fantastic oboe part throughout. Yeah. But anyway, I love it. Of all these pieces, I've played that the most in concert, and that isn't very much, but at least sometimes.
This is extraordinary. I think he just lost his son at that time. His son committed suicide, but his daughter was also born around then, and it must have been a very uncertain time. But then to kind of have this sort of world of luscious sound.
Yes.
I mean, should we have a tiny bit of the second movement just to get a sense of what that's?
Sure.
Like?
I mean, hope people will
very
hear.
quick.
It's all on Spotify. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. People can hear it.
The opening of this is lovely.
Yeah, just to give you an idea, it's. I mean, and then the last movement. This is just. Very, very. It's very, very confident and also very spacious, but you can see the sort of accusation there of why can you write such music at this and this idea of music being sort of a one-way street of progression from tonality to atonality, and somehow people who deviated from that narrative being told that they wouldn't be as interesting and equal.
But I think that these composers and other people who, for instance, I encountered through my parents, such as Kenneth Layton, who was a great friend. Now, these are composers that musicians love to play. So it's a musician's musician, So it's not anything to do with fashion. It's to do with you connect in every way. It's good for the instrument. It tells a story, and that's why I love all this music, because it has such seriousness of purpose, really.
And he remained really true to that, and it's very, very sophisticated. It's not at all, reproducing historical style. It's just taking it further and being very sincere with it. So let's move on to Berthold Goldschmidt and his cello concerto. Now, Berthold Goldschmidt was quite a bit younger than Hans Gál.
And he came from Germany, not Austria.
Yeah, that's right. And he was born in 1903 and originally from Hamburg, but then in the 20s was, he won a Mendelssohn Prize and was very his music was performed quite widely, and he also had an opera already in repertory, and then it sort of all went sour for him, of course, because of the Nazi takeover when he came to Britain. But he was also, you know, a very good conductor and an active musician. And into the 1950s, he was very busy in London and very active. And this work is from 1953. It's actually a time in the early 50s when he wrote his 3 big instrumental concertos, also I think the violin and clarinet concerto as well. And it was written for William Pleath, who taught your mother, of course. Yeah, so that's...
Yeah, because the people who were, obviously I think it's whoever was around. It's like in Mozart's time, Mozart wrote for people who were there. And if you were lucky enough, why there wasn't a good enough cellist in Mozart's time for him to write, you know, but clarinet, yes. Or singers, of course, violin. But yeah, so William Pleath was #1 cellist at that time and played lots and lots of new works, you know, Rubra and so many other people, Reizenstein as well, they played together. And so this is another piece, but it didn't have a very long life, the piece. You know, it was only much later, after Simon Rattle rediscovered him, realizing that Goldschmidt had worked with Schoenberg and knew all of this, that he just was fascinated and started making people interested again. And much too late for Goldschmidt, but
for him personally, I mean,
yes.
He experienced this renewed interest in his work when he was in his 80s, really. Yes. But well, let's have a listen to the
it's a very different style from
cello
Gál.
concerto. Yeah.
It's quite a tour de force. Yeah.
Do you think there's anything in this music that where the presence of Goldschmidt in Britain has an effect?
There's 1 or 2 bars in the Hans Gál that sound like Finzi. Amazingly. There's nothing in the Goldschmidt that sounds British, in the sense that, I recognize Vaughan Williams. In the Goldschmidt, in the Reizenstein, although he studied with Vaughan Williams, you hear more of the influence of Hindemith, but possibly in the orchestration, there's Vaughan Williams' effect. And in the Seiber, which we'll come to, not at all. So I think all those composers really had their world, their harmonic world. They'd taken it with them, and it was there and stayed. A little, very much like Korngold, who was writing the Hollywood sound when he was 11 in Vienna. You know, comes to, and now we say, well, that sounds like Hollywood. Well, no, it sounds like Korngold. I went to hear a Korngold opera the other day, and you say, well, that's Hollywood, but you realize, well, no, Hollywood took it from him.
It tells you something about this sort of strange association of music with place and sounds, and how much fiction there is with that, isn't there?
Well, sometimes it's very true, I find. I mean, personally, you know, there are certain composers and places that you just, Benjamin Britten totally, I find, you know. If you've been to Aldborough, if you stood on the beach, you hear Peter Grimes, it's there, it's 100%, you know, that's the sound of everything. But not all his music, but certain places, there's so much. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned Reizenstein, and the cello concerto is next on our list. Just to say, Reizenstein was born in 1911. He was originally from Nuremberg, but then studied in Berlin and studied with Hindemith, or was very influenced by Hindemith as well. And there's a lovely photo that his son, John Reizenstein, sent me, where Hindemith, he teaches his students how to write for wind instruments by making them all play the clarinet. And apparently the sound was not particularly appealing, but they did learn to write how a clarinet functions. And he then came earlier than the others, actually. He came in 1934 to Britain and continued his studies. So if he was born in 1911, he was only in his early 20s when he came, and he continued his studies at the RCM with Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was, by the way, a very great helper of emigre musicians. He supported them. He, in Reizenstein's case, he campaigned for him to come out of internment because it was not good for musicians to be locked up and not being able to practice and develop. And he then later on also supported the Anglo-Austrian Music Society. So Vaughan Williams was an important figure really in this whole history. But I think his connection with Reizenstein may have been actually a connector between him and the émigré in community and story. Of course, other émigrés also received scholarships at the Royal College of Music, for example, the pianist Paul Hamburger or Erika Fox, although she studied after the war. But so Reizenstein then develops a double career really as a pretty successful composer, but also as a virtuoso pianist.
Yeah, incredible pianist. He had a trio with Maria Littke and I think Pleath at the time. But anyway, yes, he was very, very much present on the concert stage.
So let's listen to his cello concerto, which is, I believe, an early work. So it originally was written in 1936 when he was probably still a student here at the college, and then revised in 1948 and published still later. But
the opening tutti is, you don't hear the cello for a while. It's a monster tutti, I call it, because it felt like I was surrounded by this enormous sound, which it is, and it's a huge play for the cello. It's one of the most difficult pieces I've played, and but the slow movement, which we might hear in a minute, is particularly beautiful and very Jewish in character. Actually, it has a certain flavour. Anyway, let's see if
let's hear the very beginning, just a few bars. Beautiful.
It's really a good piece.
Yeah. And it's yet another composer who really did not subscribe to atonality and really went his own way. And,
Well, there was a lot more to do still, in the sense that obviously he was very influenced by Hindemith. He felt, yes, I can go further with this kind of thing. And Arnold Cook, who was similarly influenced, they were great friends. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Good, and I think we now we don't have the same hang-ups anymore as maybe people had in the Glock era. And I'm sure not everybody had them as well.
Thank goodness, no.
Yeah, so, and the last composer we wanted to talk about is Mátyás Seiber.
Although I think in brackets you might want to mention Joe Horovitz.
Oh,
because Joe Horovitz is
I mean, Joseph Horovitz, of course. I mean, have you? You've recorded some of his music.
Well,
too,
the point is that, of course, he was here for many, many, many years.
Of course, he only died last year. We recently had a concert to celebrate his music here. We actually an evening concert with only it's wonderful colleague, and of course we both saw him many times.
That's right. But I mean, I knew him a lot well, and often saw him. But the interesting thing was that he'd made an orchestration of the Grieg cello sonata for what's his name, Carr, Gary Carr, the double bassist. And I heard a recording of this, and I said, well, Gary Carr is extraordinary, but why not have a cellist play the cello sonata with orchestra? He said, oh, I never thought of that. So, he'd made quite a few cuts because it was a bit of a long play for the bass. So so Ben, my son, filled in the gaps, and I played it a lot. So Joe Horowitz's orchestration of the Grieg, which is first class. So we had a lot of contact over that, but sadly it wasn't a real piece that he'd written. But Seiber, you were going to say.
Yeah. So Mátyás Seiber, and I'm sorry we can't hear Joe's, but I hope you can find a recording somewhere. So Mátyás Seiber, again, a very mobile story of a composer moving around. Born in 1905 in Budapest, studied with Kodály, and then really wrote. Was part of this movement of collecting folk music, and making it, also writing very, very sophisticated music, but tonal music. He then moved to Frankfurt and worked as a composer for radio and also a conductor there. Played the cello on a cruise liner between Hamburg and New York in a string quartet, but actually also got to know jazz on that cruise ship, and then was so interested in jazz that he composed pieces to learn the style for people, and leichte Tänze, which is still very, very widely played today, and became the first professor of jazz in a conservatoire ever, I believe, in Frankfurt. But then there was a big anti-Semitic campaign, and also racist campaign, I suppose, against black music, and in Germany, horrible Germany. I mean, it just infuriates me as a German too. So he then lost his job when the Nazis came to power as a professor in Frankfurt, and tried Budapest again, but it was also not a good place anymore. And then came to Britain, and of course here he wrote, music for propaganda films during the war, cabaret music, and also really, really serious 12-tone music, something he had already started doing in Frankfurt, and became such a widely influential composer as a teacher, also for the Society for the Promotion of New Music. He was very involved with that, with the International Society for Contemporary Music. Wrote for people like Peter Pears, his Ulysses, which is a big orchestral cantata, and this work is from the later part of his life, from 1957, so 3 years before he died. He died very tragically, very young, when he was doing a tour in South Africa, and he had an accident on a safari tour. So it's a great tragedy, really. But what about his music for you?
This is interesting because he must have always wanted to write a more extensive cello piece. And he
being a cellist,
being a cellist, yes, and he understood the cello well. And so he wrote eventually this three pieces, the first of which exists in a very successful version for cello and piano. So I think it must have been the first one he wrote, Fantasy it's called. The second one, which is a very difficult piece, we might play a little bit of that, very brilliant. And the third is serial style, and very a bit like Bartók night music kind of atmosphere. It hardly has been played. Amaryllis Fleming played it abroad. She played it in Italy. She played it whenever she possibly could. And that's how I think I first heard. I must have gone for a lesson and seen the music on the stand. I often, because she'd send me upstairs to warm up before she came up to teach me, and I would snoop around and see what was on the stand and I found out about all sorts of pieces. You know, what you practicing? You know, oh my goodness me! Oh, right, yes, I'm ready. And I remember Tre Pezzi, but so I was thrilled to be able to record it.
So let's hear just very briefly the first one,
This is
the
very
well-known
Hungarian.
And there you have it. You know, you have something Hungarian. You have is a brilliance. You know, in a craft, and you have the 12-tone influence. Yes. And it is actually, it does coexist in his music totally naturally.
Naturally, yeah, it is. I think, I mean, I hope that the future will be bright for all these composers, and that all this fantastic younger generation of cellists will start, you know, saying that there's more to. It's always the problem that we have this problem that concert promoters are afraid that nobody's going to come, and therefore the Algarve Cello Concerto is played every day of the year. And you know, this is really hard work to get people to actually program any of this, and yet I think it would be a refreshing. And that's what I do all the time. I mean, and that's what I enjoy to especially British music generally. I mean, the next month I'm playing Finzi and Moiren, and these are great British cello pieces, and they need to be heard. And it's just a weird profession we're in, that some of the best things just get neglected.
Well, thank you for talking to us today about this, because hopefully that will remedy some of it and get some more people interested in this music.
At least the recordings are there so people can hear it. That was a big help, I think.
And the Concerthaus Orchestra particularly. I mean, I'm glad that you've done that. And also, it's nice to talk to you about, you know, your own connection with the history of this music through your family. So thank you very much for talking to us today. And I hope that you know, your association with the Royal College of Music will also continue for a long time. Thank you very much, Raphael Wallfisch.
Okay.